So, hello everybody, dear colleagues, distinguished guests. It is my true honor and a pleasure to have the opportunity to host and greet our today's guest, Mr. Geret Wol from the UK in front of our institute. And the pleasure and the honor is even bigger if you consider the fact that this is Geret's first visit not only to our institute, but even to Belgrade and Serbia as well. So, welcome Geret. I hope that you had a lot of really nice impressions that you already made during the last day that we're going to share afterwards on non-formal part of your visit. So since I know that Geret is really humble and he won't talk about his accomplishments, I would just like to use the opportunity to briefly present our today's guests. Geret is a doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham, UK, and the Institute for Development Studies in Kolkata. He's also an assistant editor to the within the journal of Commonwealth Journal of Local Government since 2013, and is currently assistant editor of Local Government Studies Journal, right? If I got that correctly. His field of research covers topics ranging from public policy issues, local government, development studies with focus even on human development, etc. Right? Geret is currently sitting as in the board of 3 different academic associations: the UK's Development Studies Association, the Human Development and Capabilities Association, and the International Association for LADAC Studies. Apart from his academic engagement, Geret is also currently working as a consultant and research data, what is the name of
Consultation Research Data Officer.
Yeah. Okay, within the London Borough of Barnet, right? Barnet, yeah. And previously worked for almost a decade for the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, which is actually a global association of national associations and ministries dealing with the local governments from 45 states of former British Empire that were part, 54.
And not all of them were former British colonies, but
most of them were part of a former British Empire. Geret and I met last year in Sweden at the Local Democracy Academy, right? That was the name of the conference, which was organized by the International Center for Local Democracy. And over there I got to know more about his field of research, and we kind of talked and we kind of agreed that it is really important for us to know a bit more about the local government studies worldwide, having in mind the field of research that our institute deals with. And in his today's lecture, Geret will focus on the research of, on the findings of the research project he led, that was dealing with the role of local governments within the post-conflict processes. And he will focus today on the specific case studies of Ruanде, Sierra Leone, Northern Ireland, and Sri Lanka, yes. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Geret, and you can proceed with your presentation.
Thanks, Andrea, and morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. That was grand. And this particular piece of work, it's the paper was published in 2017, so it's a few years old, but obviously the conflicts and the post-conflict processes, some things have moved on a little bit, particularly say Northern Ireland with the issues and mess up of Brexit and all these sorts of things. There's other things that in political science it could be said, but the main thing that it was part of a research program when I was working for the Commonwealth Local Government Forum with a group of academics, first initially based in my department at Birmingham, but then expanding out. Primarily UK-focused academics, but also working with colleagues in the Global South. And we produced a special issue in Third World Quarterly that then came out as a book, because that's what Routledge do. And this was one paper that particularly. So most of the other papers are single country case studies, talking a bit about the decentralization process post-peace and how that's going. And then most of those academics were really specialists on that country. They probably did their PhDs on that topic and then have continued in projects. So I'll leave this copy with Andrea for the library here. And so there's stuff from from Lebanon, from Ruanda, from Colombia, and other chapters, which obviously we won't dwell on here. I'll focus on my chapter, and the thing that I felt I could probably bring to it as to add to the conversation was, because my role at the Commonwealth Local Government Forum was networking the ministries and the national associations of local government. So I think is there a national association of local authorities, Serbia, or something like that? Yeah. So those institutions, those organisations that bring the municipalities and bring the local governments together, and the ministries responsible for stopping devolution, for trying to make things happen. The Commonwealth Local Government Forum brings those together across these 54 countries and does, knowledge exchange, and particularly is about that push for devolution. But what we felt was quite useful is a bit of a comparative look at how that process has worked, particularly in these post-conflict settings. I'm not a post-conflict specialist, although having been part of this research project, I know a reasonable amount about it now. And likewise, I'm not also a country specialist in any of these 4 countries that much, even Northern Ireland, which is my own country. And I was telling Andrew before, it's not something you learn that much about. Obviously, Good Friday Agreement was 97, I was 17 at the time. You hear a bit about it, and I'm pretty sure now it's taught probably a bit in class, unless people are avoiding what the problems of trying to say what the issues with Brexit were and how that's affecting the Good Friday Agreement. So in terms, maybe some of the other papers in the book, if you're actually really interested in exactly what happened in each country. So what my paper did gives a bit of a kind of overview. The method that I came to it was actually talking to the local government officials in that country. So from the National Association, often the Chief Executive of the National Association, or the political leaders, so the elected mayor who's now the president of the association, those sorts of people, and sometimes officers or the minister for decentralisation, so it's from the local government narrative. So it's coming from the local government sector to say what they feel their contribution to peace building and the challenges of that are. It's where this paper came from. So that's kind of the background to the research project. We'll cover a little bit about when decentralisation supports or undermines peace, a little bit about ideas of state legitimacy and decentralisation. We'll go talk a little bit about some of the kind of interesting nuances in each of those 4 cases. Like I say, the overview in the paper or overall isn't a full expose of local government in that country or what's happened with peace, but it just brings out some of those core interesting issues for comparison. And then a little bit about, say, the future research agenda, which maybe is the kind of thing that some of you guys may be working on or interested in. Before that, I'll just say a little bit about CLGF, because it was done as I was working for them and under the auspices of CLGF. So interesting talking to an audience that isn't part of the Commonwealth. Obviously, the Commonwealth, most people vaguely heard that it kind of exists, this network. It's, I believe, except I think for the Organisation of Islamic Countries, I think it's the largest non-UN global network of countries, 54 at the moment. We had 2 new ones join last year, Gabon and Togo, and obviously Gabon's currently not having a great time with democracy, just had a coup and things. So the vast majority of countries became part of the Commonwealth as they gained independence in the 50s and 60s things. And actually the modern Commonwealth was founded in 1949, proposed by Nehru. So as India became independent, they chose to obviously not have the Queen of England, or the King of England as it was at the time, as their head. They have a presidential head, but they felt this kind of free network of countries was still a useful network, and so it was proposed that this free association of friendly countries would continue. So whilst prior to that, it existed with the creation, with like South Africa and Canada and others that were as they became independent. As the colonialisation process happened, each of those countries kind of effectively continued as part of the Commonwealth. Particularly since we've just had the death of the Queen and other things like that, the people get quite confused about countries of the realm, where the Queen is still, or the King is head of state, and it's kind of irrelevant. Obviously, the vast majority of countries in the Commonwealth are republics. I think there's 14 left for mainly small island states in the Caribbean and the Pacific that nominally have, and obviously Canada and Australia have the King of England's head of state, but that's kind of a totally separate thing to the Commonwealth, which is mainly republics coming together, doing a bit of knowledge sharing on policy and things like that. So they'll have networks of education ministers, networks of obviously most of the social sectors, things like peace, things like cybersecurity, those sorts of issues are the kind of stuff that they focus on. CLGF itself is the organisation that brings together these, looks at local government and brings the ministries and the national associations together, and individual councils and mayors. So it has a network of cities, it has a network looking at women in local government, it has country level programmes either funded by the EU or by DFID or by the UN, looking at often capacity building and things for ahead of elections and that sort of stuff. And local economic development is a particular programme, and localising the SDGs is another quite large programme. So it's that kind of quite core what local government does for development-y type things, including representation and stuff. So that's CLGF. So, CLGF had done some particular work in post-conflict, particularly in Sierra Leone and the Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands is a particularly interesting case, and there's some paper which I reference, which is in our journal, that talks about how Honiara obviously had similar, what they called troubles, a bit like Northern Ireland, and obviously they had a peace mission, primarily Australian, that came in, and what the role of the recreation of the local council, the city council, was in terms of that peace building process is quite interesting in its own right. We did that would have been the 5th case study in the paper, but we decided 4 was enough, but certainly that's an interesting one in its own right. And so we felt that getting an academic group together to look at this and to look at some cases from across and beyond the Commonwealth countries and what kind of knowledge gaps there are in this would be a useful one. So from my side, as I said, the conversations were primarily with senior representatives from the local government sector in each of those countries. So in terms of the literature and stuff, so obviously within coming at it from the local government sector, it's primarily about the discussion of devolution, political devolution, including obviously fiscal devolution, but we don't focus on the finances and the money, but political devolution, the power being decentralised, and how that and what that does for peace, for social cohesion and otherwise. So there's some quite interesting work by Jean-Paul Fagu at LSE, particularly looking at the role of decentralisation in peace and in democracy as a whole. So they use a term looking at deeper and more subtle democracy. So the idea that if you've got proper inclusive representation at the local level, you've got a much more sustainable and deeper democracy than a more kind of national level multi-party democracy, which is absolutely fine, but it's not necessarily very representative of the people on the ground and their identities and their differences. It could be, but it often isn't. And so being able to have much more inclusive local democracy can enable much more robust and resilient system for when tensions rise. Then there's actually representation and inclusive institutions that can then look at mitigating those tensions before they actually, say, exploded into armed conflict otherwise. There's a bit on the literature about how decentralisation has been used, particularly basically as a gift from the centre, either as an electoral strategy if it's seen as something that will benefit the national parties, the governing party, and also in terms of pushes, certainly in the global south, for development. So how the World Bank particularly, but also the UN broadly and the bilateral agencies since the 90s have pushed the idea that decentralisation is much better for service delivery in local government. So in terms of the countries we're going to look at, that's kind of part of the political economy background as to the decentralisation conversations that have happened there and the structure and legislation that's in place. One thing I haven't checked is actually how long I should be talking. Are you going to give me a 5-minute warning?
I will give you a 5-minute warning.
Grand.
Don't worry, I think you will.
Yeah, that's grand. It's not loads. I think there's we're on size 6 of 15, so it shouldn't go on too long. So again, a little bit on the background on the theory. So quite a useful one, I think, in this context is the idea of incongruent federalism. So the idea that if you decentralize, particularly around identities, cultural and political identities, and as you increase the power in the local area, if that's based pretty much solely on, say, an ethnic and linguistic community, then it may actually increase the likelihood of separatist movement. So in Sri Lanka, we'll come on to, obviously the Tamil north, the province of the northern province in Sri Lanka is based on the Tamil identity, and like with India, the states are drawn around linguistic cultural lines. As the states are strong cultural linguistic identities, then they're much more likely to have very strong independent aims, and so more likely to provide to increase, if there's tensions, say separatist movements and things like that. Obviously in India you may get that up in Punjab. They had a separatist movement and those sorts of things. So Nigeria is a particularly interesting counterexample. So Nigeria has historically, since independence, had flashpoints of violence and separatist movements in the Biafra War and things like this, but actually the states in Nigeria are not based around linguistic, cultural, ethnic identities, and the states are actually much lower level, and so whilst the states are relatively strong identities, there isn't like groupings. They're not grouped together to look at kind of separatist movements and things. Obviously there still is the Igbo identity and culture for Biafra is still quite strong, and there's still a narrative and a lot of pain from that war. However, there isn't a political entity that the Igbo are under to push for, say, a separatist movement. So it's that sort of idea. And so the last one is when digitalised is the issue of local government and its contribution to conflict. So using a couple of the examples that I draw on in Northern Ireland and Rwanda, the decentralised units historically, prior to the conflicts, exacerbated the risk of conflict because of their exclusion and marginalisation of particular people within the community. So in Northern Ireland, from 1921, when the Northern Ireland was created, within a year, all the councils in Northern Ireland were all Protestant run, and the massive significant marginalisation of the Catholic communities, the Catholic minorities in all those areas. So they were excluded from school. The schooling system was effectively two separate systems, and obviously the Catholic schools were under-resourced. Things like access to work within the local councils, access to housing was all incredibly unequal between the Catholic and the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. Likewise in Rwanda, so since the independence and in Rwanda the history is that the Tutsi were the minority but were the ruling elite. Then after independence, with the support of the Belgians, the Hutu became the majority, or were the majority, and became the likewise, like in Northern Ireland, oversaw all the councils and massively marginalised and stigmatised the Tutsi identity, and so that's why there was significant exodus from the country because of that marginalisation. Sorry, I dropped my mic. So the last bit on the theory, so around the ideas of the legitimacy of the state. So decentralisation and the ability that the local councils can have to include people in the conversation and the political conversations can increase state legitimacy generally in the role of the citizenship and the diverse and possibly competing citizenship to provide some sort of greater voice within political institutions. However, this, whilst that's quite a well-known idea and argument for decentralisation, there's some interesting work by a colleague of mine, Claire McLaughlin, on Sri Lanka. She's at Birmingham. Citizens themselves don't necessarily identify that much with all of this. So they just want state institutions to work. They just want utilities and whatever else to function, and whilst they're working fine, they don't really care where it comes from, and it's just whether it's centre, whether it's whatever. If it doesn't work, then there'll be a blaming game as to whose fault it is. But again, the citizens don't necessarily care that much about that. They just want it to work. Obviously, it may be that the local politicians are the ones that are easiest to access, but MPs may also be the people that are kind of saying, well, it's their fault, and so the idea about how decentralization can enhance the legitimacy, that's certainly true, but it can also be depending on the kind of type of issues that the local authority are overseeing. So relatively quickly, I'll run through just some of the key interesting features of each of the 4 case studies that the paper looks at. So for the Northern Ireland Troubles, as they call them, the UUP monopolised the provincial government for over 50 years, as mentioned, with unequal access to schooling, council jobs and housing. The Provincial Assembly was suspended in 1973 and then had direct rule from Westminster. And the local government reform enabled some form of multi-party democracy to happen. So one of the key innovations, as it were, towards peace in Northern Ireland was the promotion of cross-community engagement at the local government within that period. So prior to the Good Friday Agreement, so for over 20 years in the 70s through the 80s, whilst there was obviously, that's when the height of the IRA and the unionist paramilitary activities were happening, the councils themselves were becoming much more representative, were becoming cross-community and able to have people working together from different communities, and that paved the way for the ability to have this power sharing agreement, which is basically the background to the Good Friday Agreement. So the fact that in the Northern Ireland Assembly it's power sharing, it has to be both parties represented at the centre, so the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister are from both parties, and all the policies have to be effectively a consensus between both parties. So it's not a majoritarian system, it's a consensus system, and that's the basis of peace in Northern Ireland. And that came about because of the experimentations at the local council level through the 70s, 80s and 90s. The Sri Lankan War, obviously the separatist war from the Tamil Tigers in the 80s and 90s. There was obviously quite a lot of, again, it was a kind of guerrilla war similar to Northern Ireland. There were attempts to broker peace, particularly with India being involved, but they kind of failed, and obviously Rahul Gandhi lost his life, partly because of that. And basically the post-war councils in multi-ethnic areas do have kind of forced proportional representation from across the different communities. So particularly in the east, but also in the Tamil North, the idea is that they actually do represent, aren't taken over either by a minority who's got a kind of power base there, an elite or otherwise. So they only until recently, obviously it was a military victory, so the peace negotiations never amounted to peace. So there was a military victory over the Tamil Tigers, and one of the issues until quite recently is that the governors and things were all centrally appointed and stuff, but now they at least appoint people of the ethnic minority from the region, and there's a feeling that it's a bit more representative. There is a continued reluctance to devolve certain functions to the provinces, including trade, policing, and land, and that has created continued tensions. And as we mentioned at the start, that one of the issues is to what extent should you keep devolving greater autonomy. Out of the cases we've got, obviously in the UK, we've probably got one of the most decentralised local areas was Scotland. So obviously Scotland itself has a secessionist movement. It's not a conflict zone, and it had a referendum and it was very close, and it may have another one at some point if Westminster allowed it. But the idea that you devolve almost everything, so Scottish Parliament has say over almost everything except defence and a few other things, but the idea that the identity of that region can be very, very strong, obviously actually supports that idea that it may also then wish to just be an independent country, which is where the caution in Sri Lanka may partly come from. Sierra Leone civil war, local councils existed since independence, but then were replaced by these very centralised appointees, committees of management, and they were incredibly corrupt and elite captured. And so the justification, so when the civil war broke out, and there were speeches put out on radio and stuff kind of saying from the rebels why this has to happen. We have to have this war because of all this level of corruption, because of all this level of exclusion. And so these were the things that they stated. So there was obviously extractive revenues and incredibly poor service delivery. And basically there was a feeling across rural Sierra Leone that the elites in the city were just capturing everything and controlling any council activity that happened outside the city, and they were just not getting any benefits from any sort of development and extraction and things. So the peace accord in Sierra Leone, there was an agreement, and in the end the war had been bubbling on for so long. It was 97, I think, even the British military even was invited to try and help create peace, so it was part of the creating a peace force to ensure peace happened there, and the peace agreement didn't mention decentralisation as an actual thing. So the decentralisation in Sierra Leone that happened post peace was mainly about donor and development agencies pushing for development and service delivery, not necessarily, say, representative democracy. And it continues to have significant capacity constraints and gaps in terms of service delivery, but it's significantly better than it was prior to the war in terms of residents' views on that. So finally, again, this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of 4 very complex conflicts, and I will try not to assume too much of what people know about any of these things. So obviously the Rwandan civil war and genocide, the local government and the independent Rwanda from the 60s through the 60s and 70s was all monopolised by Hutu and the exclusion of the historically privileged Tutsi, and then many of them went off to Uganda and elsewhere, exiled, and obviously they organised, and so the RPF, is it RPF? They're formed in Uganda and launched an attack back on Rwanda. They controlled the north of the country for a while, and then a peace agreement was brokered. Then obviously, as most people will know, following the death of the president in a controversial plane downing, the genocide took place. Obviously the end of the genocide was a military victory for the RPF. And the post-genocide nation building has had a very kind of relatively unique approach to peace building, which is this significant campaign to basically blanket out any idea of ethnic difference, which is, for those who know anything about it, is seen as a colonial imposition in the first place. And so there's significant campaigns about that we are Rwandan, we're not Hutu, we're not Tutsi, we are Rwandan, we are building the country of Rwanda. Obviously this plays in significantly to the Tutsi narrative, because obviously they're the minority. So if you're not, there's no statistics that shows where the Tutsi are in government, how they're doing in terms of economic, social progress or anything like that. It's just Rwanda and the development of Rwanda. There was some opening up of relatively recently of the idea that Hutus could identify as Hutu for the purpose of apologising for the genocide against the Tutsis. But other than that, it's about this idea that we are nation building. And again, there's significant justifications for such an extreme event of a genocide to go to such extreme lengths for peace building. And if you talk to any Rwandans, the national narrative is very, very strong in terms of not being too critical of this whole process. Obviously, there are some Hutus who never became part of that nation building process, and they're out in the Congolese jungle trying to continue to fight, or whether it's diaspora internationally thinking that there should at least be some sort of pluralism in the country, and the idea of a move towards some sort of multi-party democracy isn't yet anywhere close. And obviously Kagame has a very strong hold and a very strong thing. However, obviously the country itself has become a donor darling. It's seen as the Singapore of Africa, and all these sorts of things. And across Africa, it's seen as quite a strong advocate for African solutions to African problems, and those sorts of things. So whilst local government does exist relatively strongly, it's not in any sort of multi-party democracy. So all the local councils are all obviously party. It's effectively a one-party state, so all the local councils are effectively one party. However, say from our point of view, from the Commonwealth, in terms of continued engagement with that, is that if there was to be the semblance of seeded multi-party democracy, it's through local councils that would likely be able to take shape, and multiple voice would be able to come through. So some conclusions from just looking at those 4 countries and some comparisons between those kind of cases. So local government, it contributes. So the local government post-conflict has contributed to the risk of going back into conflict in all those cases. So in terms of whether it's from a developmental point of view, people's lives are just generally better than the exclusion that they had before. The local councils are set up to be inclusive, and all the services are not separated by community and ethnicity. The quasi-federal structures, particularly in Northern Ireland and Sri Lanka, have stifled devolution down to the councils, because obviously the assembly exists, the provinces exist, they don't like to give power to the councils and give greater things, so that's causes some problems, and particularly, for instance, in Northern Ireland at the moment, the Northern Ireland Assembly doesn't exist. The DUP have vetoed its existence, mainly to complain about the border from the Brexit negotiations, but also because they're now no longer the largest party, and so there's some politicking there, which is obviously not great for democracy, and not great that it's overseen directly from Westminster, but that does in some way mean that the councils are actually greater empowered at the moment, because the councils are pretty much the only political entity in Northern Ireland that is then representative, except their MPs that go to Parliament. And people may know a slight nuance of Northern Ireland politics is that if you're an MP from Sinn Féin, which obviously there's a significant number of them, they don't go to Parliament. They veto Parliament, so there's significant problems of representation in the country. So pretty much local councils is it for those people. That's all they have. The idea that there is the decentralization is part of the developmental state, so it's all about progress in terms of people's livelihoods, people's lives. Obviously that helps towards, at least if that's done in an equitable way, an inclusive way, that's reduces tensions and risks of conflict, but it wasn't part of the negotiations or the ending of the peace. But it feels particularly that the cases of Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka and Sierra Leone, there is a deeper and more subtle democracy because of those inclusive local government political entities. So those entities being more inclusive, being cross-community, there's forums at the local level for addressing particularly just general everyday life, but also the kind of transitional justice that needs to happen post-conflict. Now, Northern Ireland has never had a peace and reconciliation commission or anything like that. It still has to work out pretty much ad hoc at the local council. There's still a lot of tension, a lot of weight, a lot of issues, because everyone knows someone who was murdered, everyone knows someone who's been killed because of the tensions, and there hasn't been a national reconciling with that, but at the local level, at least they're able to bring people together, do memorials, do community activities that brings those communities to be able to talk to each other much more. Whilst obviously Rwanda's the outlier in these 4 stories, because it doesn't have the pluralism that is the case, and the main route through which Kagame and the national government are looking to build that peace is basically the shifting of identity from an ethnic identity to a national identity of the we are Rwandan, we are all one, and not identifying as Hutu and Tutsi, which is quite extreme and probably reasonably unique globally. So that's the main issues. I think that's probably, close to the end. I've got two last slides, I think. So lessons for policy. So for meaningful decentralization, functions for councils and finance to follow it must be empowering and constitutionally protected and inclusive to ensure that that it doesn't exacerbate conflict risk, and this should be going beyond the quasi-provincial level. So whilst now peace negotiations, peace accords, whatever, will probably put in place what should happen at, say, if you're creating some sort of federal structure. So the Good Friday Agreement focuses on the assembly and how that works. It doesn't really say, obviously the legislation says what should go to councils, and it hasn't really pushed through, and it isn't part of the what has to happen, and so it's still a bit ad hoc as to what the councils, the functions and the power that the councils actually have, and that should be greater protected. The trade-offs between competing political claims and the development objectives and democracy need to kind of be continually negotiated and continually part of the conversation at the local level, the very local level within the local area, right up to obviously the province and the national level, rather than just literally this is the structure for the provincial council and that's it. And the continued efforts to reduce marginalisation need to obviously be accompanied by inclusive development across all the communities, particularly the historically marginalised, those that were suffering prior to a conflict, and via these devolution initiatives to include people, make sure the voices and are included in any developmental growth and inclusion. And then for the research agenda moving forward, so obviously each of these cases is quite hard because they're all very unique political conflict situations. So understanding those nuances, which a lot more of the other papers in the book do to some degree, really explore the differences of how these conflicts have played out, the post-conflict narratives and stories, and the roles of local government have played in that, need to be much more detailed, understood in that broader narrative and political context as to what is the role of local government in all of this. And where there has, and whilst we're all very good, and the national associations and ministries and the national narratives are good at kind of saying, well, here's a nice initiative that we did, we're not very good at saying where the limitations and the failures have been. So understanding where innovations may have been initiated and understanding where they haven't worked is something that we're not very good at politically, because these are all political organisations still looking to be re-elected and otherwise. That ability to be able to reflect on the challenges and where people have failed. There's in my paper particularly, but in others as well, there is obviously some good work on the role of women in post-conflict situations, but not so much in post-conflict decentralisation. So the national narrative as to how women brought people to the peace table, how women were part of the peace negotiations and things, there's quite a decent amount of work there, but not so much in decentralisation. There was a paper out just last week, with a little bit of this, it talks about how rebel parties that came from rebel groups have significantly more women put forward for national politics than not parties that didn't come from rebel groups, and there's some interesting stuff there, but the same analysis hasn't yet been done at the local level. So to what extent women have been brought into that conversation and making those the local institutions much more inclusive across the communities, including obviously women more, rather than just by ethnicity or by group, marginalised group, isn't yet really known and analysed. And it wouldn't be that hard to do, it's just some of the data isn't necessarily always available. And then the last one is the role of local governments in reintegrating ex-combatants and how people live together at a local level with people who may well have murdered people that you knew and loved, and the role of local government in both providing basic services, housing and jobs and those sorts of things, but also that kind of reconciliation and transitional justice, which in most of these countries there's not been a very great success. And I say in Northern Ireland there's been no reconciliation really there, and the role of local government in trying to manage that is probably under-researched. But yeah, that was my paper. I think Andrea sent the actual full paper round, so if you're interested, feel free to delve in a bit into it. And I will leave the book. Like I say, the book is a special issue of a journal, and hopefully you've got access to Taylor and Francis Journal, Third World Quarterly. So each of those there's papers that kind of complement them, at least on Rwanda and Northern Ireland and other papers that talk about other countries in the book, and obviously there's the references that then delve a bit further into some of the other conflicts that are related. But yeah, any thoughts, reflections, how it may possibly talk to situations here or in the region, it'd be great to chat about. As I say, I don't know much about this region at all, and it'd be great to hear how any reflections you feel it may talk to experience here. That'd be great. But thank you.
Thank you, Geret, once again for being here and for this really insightful and interesting lecture. And I think there's a lot of time to dive into Q&A sessions, so if somebody has something that is not put clear, or if you're interested in learning more about Geret's research, feel free. Dusha.
First of all, thank you for your lecture and your time. I wanted to ask you about these success cases and this sort of shift to a deeper and more supple democracy. For me, listening to you, I see two different versions of this success. So one is that on the local community level, let's say in Northern Ireland, these conversations are happening and barriers are being sort of crossed and torn down. And this leads to certain build-up of trust, and which shifts to the higher level where the biggest decisions are made. So this is the optimist part of the equation. The other one is that these local community engagements are more of a compensatory mechanism, a sort of release valve for tensions, and yet this shift or these agreements remain on these manageable levels, sort of keeping the important bits out of it. And this is also very important in post-colonial situations where local community leaders often did come from the local communities, and yet the government administrators were often Europeans. So could you perhaps comment whether you think, because a lot of these cases which are positive have had these local sort of positive incentives for a long time, and yet the shift to the higher level was not, from my point of view, as successful. So is that a matter of time for this translation, or are some further shifts or the evolutions needed? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I would say, I mean, there's the paper references quite a lot of initiatives, particularly in Ruanda. If anyone knows this case, there's so many initiatives. There's Give a Cow initiatives, there's volunteering initiatives, bringing community together, whether it's bringing community together through sports. There's obviously in Northern Ireland, it's all about you don't have a Catholic and a Protestant team, everyone is mixed, and so all these kind of community-based, and obviously to some extent local councils facilitating that and being representative. And as you say, it kind of keeps it at that local level. What there hasn't been success on is actually addressing transitional justice in a significant and sustainable way. That's not the case. I mean, you do get people, the vast majority of people are less, what's the word? Parochial is not the right word. What's it called? Ingrained just in their historically political tension identities, sort of thing. So the new generations will be less segregated because they've had these initiatives. However, whether it's the provincial parties in the national politics, that's still quite strongly based on these identities, and that hasn't necessarily addressed Northern Ireland. Like I say, I'm not a specialist, but I think that is the case. So one of the reasons why the DUP is no longer the largest party, and things is because there's other parties coming up through that are less based just on literally being a Protestant or a Catholic identity, and there's other parties that are green focused or inclusion focused, and their focus isn't on unity or republicanism, and there's so the new generations are bringing new politics to the table. However, these historical parties are still the largest parties and still very strong, and are causing problems. The DUP has vetoed the provincial government's existence, so it's no longer there. So that's really not a success in that way. It hasn't created a sustainable local politics that was envisaged in the peace agreement, and obviously other forces like Brexit and other stuff being dumped on it doesn't help. At the local level, you could say those initiatives are reasonably successful. In the new generations will be more integrated and appreciative of people across the communities. But how that then translates up into the higher politics hasn't fully been realised yet. Obviously, in the case of Rwanda, that's not allowed at all. So there is these initiatives to community build, but it's all mandatory. None of it's voluntarily. None of it's. Everyone has to say this is the right way to do it, and there's no dissent. From my side, from a democracy, from my perspective of democracy, Rwanda is not a success story for democracy in any way, shape, or form. It's a success story for development. It's a success story for peace building. There isn't war. There probably isn't going to be another genocide in Rwanda anytime soon. But that's because of the very strong stranglehold that Kagame has on the country, and that's not good and possibly not sustainable once Kagame goes, right? So Kagame won't live forever. What comes after, we will all find out in the next 20 years, right? Is that a powder keg for tensions to explode? Well, certainly there'll be a big release of political uncertainty when Kagame hands over. Obviously, I'm sure he's not an idiot. He'll have in mind some sort of secessionist activity within the party and things, but to what extent that could ever move towards multi-party democracy hasn't yet been realised. But if you talk to Rwandans, they're reasonably happy with the progress, the peace that they get. So, I can't impose the idea that they should be. Oh no, we should all be out protesting for multi-party democracy if Rwandans themselves. The issue is where that there's some people, whether it's I can't remember all the names, but obviously all those leaders of the parties, Victoria and others who have been imprisoned and things, there's some noise to show that, well, it's not being allowed, and what extent they would be support for that for that to happen. Looking at just briefly the other countries, obviously, for most people, peace is the success. So in Northern Ireland, in Northern Sri Lanka, whilst it was a military success, there isn't really transitional justice being played out for people that were victims and their families victims of the war and things. For most people, the fact that their lives are not blighted by risk of being killed is a very low benchmark, but seen as a success. So it's how that then translates into pluralism and democracy, and everyone else has got continued other tensions. So Sri Lanka's economic woes overlaid on top of politics in the country. It hasn't really realised into, say, ethnic violence. It's just everyone's annoyed with the government, so they kicked out the president. Fine, and they're trying to settle the economic woes as a country rather than basing it on ethnic division. So you could say that's a relatively good thing. But thanks. Yeah, I'm sure we could keep chatting, and we will.
Any more questions? If you guys don't mind, I would just like to use the opportunity and the privilege of being the moderator.
Before you do, just to open up, I'd love to hear any reflections on Serbia or the region. So folks who specialise in this area, it'd be great. I don't know enough about this, so if it's possible to hear a little bit about how people feel, reflections in the Balkans, talk to this, it would be great to hear. But,
I was about actually as we talked about these kind of issues yesterday. I was about to dive into this topic of Balkan relationship and things like that. And as I asked you, you tried to elaborate me a bit, and I think it would be beneficial to try to elaborate it again here about how do you see the role of local governments and local democracy, decentralization, devolution processes for settling the still ongoing, not that manifest but latent conflicts in Balkan region. And more specifically, we talked about the situation Serbia-Kosovo relations and the frozen conflict, and how do you see, having in mind the exacerbation of the pre-conflict tensions within the northern part of Kosovo, you compared it even to the situation in Taiwan and China. Well, can you please elaborate a bit more about these kind of things?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the key things with frozen conflicts is if you've got relatively stable institutions and peace, whether that's imposed because of international support or otherwise, it's then mainly more about winning the hearts and minds. So whether to what extent the people in that area feel that the current political setup is the right one for them, or otherwise, it's unlikely that people are, certainly if they're in a significant minority, going to be taking up arms against a major power. So Taiwan are not going to be kicking off against China, but they'll try and, because they've got the backing of the US, they can continue to be independent, and it doesn't really matter the fact that they're not on the UN and the fact that they're not recognised internationally. Doesn't make a difference to the fact that they're a self-contained independent country at this moment in time. If to what extent China's influence globally supersedes the US, and they can just basically go in and say, well, you're now part of us, and they can continue to start to control the airspace and start to control the military and the political systems, that may plan out. That's obviously China's longer term vision. But what's obviously from a peace and from a standpoint point of view is more that if China becomes the place where everyone wants to be part of, then if the people of Taiwan decide that actually we'd rather just it's better for us to be a province of China, then that's a successful, peaceful transition for that country, right? And something that those people, from a democratic point of view, have chosen to be. Obviously, it's quite hard to talk about the idea that you democratically choose to be part of a non-democratic state of China, and that's obviously the case when with Russia and the eastern part of Ukraine or whatever else. The idea that there hasn't been referendums that have been politically salient to say that these people, where people would want to be part of, it's not allowed to be actually real. So whilst the referendum for Scotland was a real referendum, the Scottish people voted and they at the moment decided to continue to be part of the UK, but they can have another referendum and be independent. That referendum is legitimate. The referendums in eastern Ukraine occupied territories isn't the legitimate referendum that has actually shown that definitely a majority wish to be a part of that. And then and that issue around territorial integrity, which is it's basically based on international law and international powers, not local self-determination and things. So the idea that whether you're able to choose to be independent or choose to secede to one of a major power neighbouring or other, no one allows that to happen, right? Very few places say you can choose. You just say no, you're part of us or you're part of us, and that's then just geopolitics that will allow that to happen. I mean, I'm all for local democracy and to right down to a point of secessionist. So if a load of people say that they wish to be independent or secede to a different country, if they're able to legitimately express that view for a referendum or something, I would support that. It's just very rare that that's able to happen.
That's the case, is there anybody else that...
Can I have a follow-up?
Of course, yeah.
I wanted to ask more from the development policy side of things. When you spoke about Ruanda and being our development sort of donor's darling, I wrote a bit about Africa, and also I usually talk about the rule of law, and it's sort of similar to decentralization in this sense that if you're a funding agency, you see it as an unmitigated good, as a binary solution. More decentralization, great. More rule of law, awesome. But when we talk about development in this holistic sense of seeking a better possible country, a better possible society to live in, it's very difficult to watch a democracy as a jigsaw puzzle, and you just, okay, we've got the peace, decentralization, great. Now let's get the rule of law, and we're on our way to there. So my question is, from a development policy standpoint, do you think that, you can talk about the UK, I don't know your expertise, there is this cognizance that perhaps focusing on these easier things to achieve, such as decentralization, could be detrimental or could give, as they say, points to authoritarian governments, which use these successes to sort of paint over faults in other more difficult positions, such as post-conflict, transitional justice, corruption, and democratic sort of improvement.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the use of decentralization by authoritarian regimes to show legitimacy, absolutely, particularly in East Africa, whether it's Museveni, whether it's and these are all Commonwealth countries that are brought, seen from a developmental point of view as to be have some degrees of success, but from a pluralistic multi-party point of view, significantly crackdowns on any sort of opposition and no pluralistic voice that's allowed to come through. From our position, say from the CLGS point of view, part of the idea is, no matter how awful that is, it's much better that we continue to engage and support local councils to exist, because if and when the system enables voice to come through, that's the place where it's likely to be able to happen. Because obviously, to the national political level, certainly when it's as it is in these countries at the moment, a winner takes all. There's going to be it's such a big the success of that is such a great thing for the ruling party. They're never going to just allow that to happen. Whereas obviously down at the local level, it's less irrelevant and less important, so they might allow things to go through. Kenya is probably the most interesting example where they've looked for devolution to address the issues of tensions and conflicts from a devolution point of view. So they've created is it 32? No, I can't remember now. Counties. I mean, one of the issues there from my perspective is that the counties now exist and there's no local government under the counties, and so that local level, but what it has done is created a more pluralistic country that enables opposition parties to win some of the governorships, the group elections, and has meant that it isn't just an absolute winner takes all at the national level. It's still very much the ruling party feeling they want the presidency and doing everything they can to keep it. However, there are people coming up, the governors are relatively powerful, they have quite a bit of resources and things, and it's multi-party. And so that happens. So it could be that's the kind of place where you would get success enabling multiple voice. Obviously, to some degree, Rwanda's not a big enough country to be like Kenya to become provincial eyes, but that's why the local councils supporting their capacity to at least be a functioning local authority to provide services, and to have a functioning council, even if it's within a one-party state. So pretty much there's relatively no one's really questioning that, but that, at least even within that, you will then get different people and different groupings of people. So even within a party, you then get different bits of the party arguing policy, and that's where you get multiple voices coming through. In terms of the rule of law, one of the key things is to what extent the rule of law is seen to only enable the continuation of the status quo. And there has been some successes at, say, challenging electoral fraud that's looked to keep the governing party in place. To what extent the Electoral Commission and the Supreme Court are independent enough to really not back the president who's just captured an election illegally. There has been those challenges, and there is some successes, and at least there's some voice in that, and it gives the opposition, however oppressed they are, some feeling, even if whether it's in Zimbabwe, whether it's in Kenya, whether it's in elsewhere. I mean, just this week Nigeria ruled, and the same thing. And to what extent those elections are absolutely free and fair, they're becoming more. Each time they're challenged. Each time the opposition thing, probably not so much in Zimbabwe, but in Kenya and Nigeria, the electoral process systems are quite good at ensuring some processes are there, and the opposition does seem to have some chance of winning, and it isn't that it's just totally captured. It's not totally a given that the party will win, whereas that is the case in Zimbabwe, and is the case in Uganda, and is the case in Rwanda. So the fact that these other countries that are leaders, and the fact that just the last thing on that is the idea that the regional bodies are quite influential on this. So the fact that with Gabon and Niger, in terms of the coups that happened most recently, the pressure that comes on from ECOWAS and the central. One of the issues there is that it wasn't so popular locally in Nigeria for ECOWAS to just go in as they did in Gambia. So when Gambia got rid of your chap, he was not very popular locally in the region. And so they were like, and he was very stupid. He was so obsessed with the fact that people thought he was great. He actually allowed an election to happen and lost, and then tried again. And so, and obviously Gambia is not so important and things. So it was very easy for ECOWAS to kind of go, and so it's surrounded by Senegal. So the Senegalese military just kind of went to the border and said, "Are you going to let it transition?" And they managed to enable him to get out and have to some degree some immunity, and transition to Roxy happened. And that, in Gambia that was allowed to happen, and it's much harder in places like Rwanda and Uganda in the east with these very powerful heads, Museveni and Kagame, that are very well respected locally, and even in Zimbabwe, the ANC and South African stuff, the history they have, they're not going to challenge at the moment.
I just want to add quickly to that, listening to the lecture, it reminded me, talking about post-conflict and post-authoritarian states, if they have this similarity that the status quo, if it is to change in a non-dramatic way, if it's a peace accord and not a military victory, there is a need for the hedging of bets from the side of the government in a sort of insurrection context or the authoritarian state. As somebody who deals with the rule of law, often an independent judiciary during an authoritarian period can be used as a sort of guarantee that there won't be reprisals, sort of extrajudicial reprisals to the former authoritarian government. And listening to you now, I can see that, as you said, perhaps they will let the opposition take the local communities, but perhaps thinking of it another way, the government, if it ever leaves, it doesn't lose everything. It can keep its strongholds and that sort of ensure its own survival in these sort of dramatic times. So perhaps it removed this binary choice. So
quite possibly, and I'd say somewhere like, say, Ethiopia, again, not a specialism that I know, but the fact that it moved, it had a peaceful transition. However, there was the tensions, and obviously Tigray's kicking off, and how that is played through. And how that's played through within rule of law. So whether there's war crimes are addressed in that region is going to be really important for the ability for Ethiopia to feel that it's actually a democracy. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, if that's all, I would just like to express my gratitude once again to you, Geret. Thank you for your time and for your insights. Thank you all for coming, and we can proceed to the non-formal part of the law.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for the invite. Nice to meet you.